Hours before dawn broke over Kyiv this morning, Russian missiles began raining down on Ukraine's capital in what officials are calling one of the most intense bombardments in months. By the time air raid sirens finally fell silent nearly 10 hours later, one person was dead, 27 wounded, including 2 children, and entire districts of the capital were without heat or electricity. The timing of this massive assault is impossible to ignore. Tomorrow, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will sit across from Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago in what both sides are describing as a potentially decisive moment in nearly 4 years of brutal warfare. While diplomats prepare talking points and negotiators fine-tune documents, Russian Kinzhal hypersonic missiles and Iranian-designed Shahed drones are delivering Moscow's real message about these peace talks. The question facing observers is whether this represents Russia's final bargaining position before serious negotiations, or Putin's way of demonstrating that he negotiates from a position of strength, regardless of diplomatic momentum. The scheduled meeting tomorrow represents a remarkable diplomatic recovery from what appeared to be an irreparable breach just 10 months ago. When Zelensky visited the Oval Office in February, the encounter with Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance went so catastrophically wrong that many in both Washington and Kyiv believed the relationship was beyond salvaging. Trump had publicly expressed frustration with continued American military aid to Ukraine, while Vance had questioned whether Ukraine's territorial integrity was worth American treasure. Zelensky, for his part, bristled at what he viewed as insufficient understanding of Ukraine's security requirements and the existential nature of the threat from Moscow. The meeting ended with barely concealed mutual irritation and no clear path forward. What changed the trajectory was a combination of factors that compelled both leaders to recalculate their positions. For Trump, the realization set in that achieving a foreign policy victory in Ukraine could define his second term and potentially eclipse the legacy questions surrounding his first presidency. The prospect of being the leader who ended Europe's deadliest conflict since World War II proved too attractive to pass up, particularly as both the Middle East and various trade disputes continued to generate negative headlines. For Zelensky, the mathematics became inescapable. With European support uncertain, particularly as right-wing parties skeptical of continued aid gained ground across the continent, and with American public opinion showing growing fatigue about the costs of supporting Ukraine, the choice became whether to negotiate now from a position of relative strength or wait and potentially face worse terms later. The appointment of Steve Witkoff, a real estate developer and Trump confidant with no diplomatic experience, as the president's special envoy initially seemed like an insult, but Witkoff's direct access to Trump and his businessman's focus on deal-making rather than diplomatic protocol turned out to facilitate rather than hinder progress. The framework being discussed tomorrow represents the culmination of months of back-channel negotiations that have involved not just Washington and Kyiv, but Moscow operating through American intermediaries. The plan has evolved significantly from its initial iteration. An earlier 28-point proposal that emerged in November after meetings between American and Russian representatives was widely criticized by Ukraine and its NATO allies as heavily tilted toward Moscow's demands. That draft has since been refined into a 20-point framework that Zelensky describes as approximately 90% complete and something he can potentially accept. Understanding what's in this document reveals both how far Ukraine has moved from its original maximalist position and how much leverage Kyiv has managed to retain despite 3 years of grinding warfare. On military force levels, Ukraine would be permitted to maintain an army of 800,000 troops, a significant concession from Russia, which had initially demanded complete demilitarization. This represents acknowledgement that any sustainable peace must include provisions for Ukrainian self-defense, though the number is substantially lower than Ukraine's current mobilized force. On NATO membership, the most neuralgic issue for Moscow throughout this conflict, Zelensky has offered a major concession. Rather than pursuing full NATO membership, Ukraine would accept security guarantees that mirror NATO's Article 5 collective defense provision, but would not involve formal alliance membership. These guarantees would come from the United States and European nations, binding them to Ukraine's defense if Russia violated the peace agreement. The duration of these guarantees remains under discussion, with Washington proposing a 15-year term that could be renewed and Kyiv pushing for a longer commitment. Zelensky indicated that securing Trump's agreement to extend beyond 15 years would be a major success from tomorrow's meeting. On territorial questions, the framework includes provisions that just months ago would have been politically impossible for Zelensky to even discuss publicly. Ukraine would withdraw its forces from portions of the Donetsk region not currently under Russian occupation, provided Moscow reciprocates by pulling back from Ukrainian territory it controls. These evacuated areas would become demilitarized zones monitored by international forces. American negotiators have proposed that these zones become free economic areas, though the practical mechanics of how such zones would function remain unclear. The status of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, seized by Russian forces early in the war and representing a constant radiological threat, remains among the most contentious unresolved issues. Zelensky confirmed he would raise this directly with Trump tomorrow. The economic component of the deal attempts to sweeten the territorial concessions with massive reconstruction funding. The framework envisions an $800 billion international investment program for Ukraine's rebuilding and development. This would be coordinated through what's being called a peace council chaired by Trump himself, which would also have authority to reimpose sanctions on Russia if Moscow violates the agreement. For Trump, this structure allows him to position himself as the guarantor and enforcer of the peace, a role that appeals to his self-image as a deal-maker. For Ukraine, it provides some assurance that America won't simply walk away once an agreement is signed. The plan also includes accelerated timelines for Ukraine's European Union membership, offering Kyiv a clear path to Western institutional integration, even as NATO membership is taken off the table. Perhaps the most significant development in the last 48 hours involves Zelensky's willingness to submit any final peace agreement to a national referendum. In an interview with Axios published Friday, the Ukrainian president revealed that if he cannot secure terms that leave Ukraine in a strong position on territorial questions, he's prepared to let the Ukrainian people decide whether to accept the framework. This represents a major shift in Zelensky's position, and one that American negotiators view as a breakthrough. For months, Zelensky had maintained that Ukraine's constitution already required any territorial changes to be approved by referendum, but he had not explicitly committed to holding one on a peace deal. His willingness to do so now signals both political calculation and genuine uncertainty about whether the terms he can secure will be acceptable to Ukrainians who have sacrificed enormously over nearly 4 years of war. The conditions Zelensky has attached to holding a referendum reveal the challenges inherent in any vote conducted during wartime. He's demanding that Russia agree to a ceasefire of at least 60 days before any referendum takes place, arguing that Ukrainians cannot be expected to make such a consequential decision while still under bombardment. This morning's attack on Kyiv underscores his point viscerally. As Zelensky put it, if Trump's envoys, or even Trump himself, want to visit Ukraine to make the case for the peace plan, but Russian missiles are still falling, voters will see the missiles, not the promises. The legitimacy of any referendum depends on citizens being able to vote safely, and Zelensky warned that if security concerns prevent turnout, the result could be questioned by both supporters and opponents of the deal. He explicitly stated it would be better to not hold a referendum at all than to conduct one where people cannot safely participate. The political calculation behind this move is sophisticated. By committing to a referendum, Zelensky transfers some of the political risk from himself to the Ukrainian people collectively. If the terms prove deeply unpopular, the referendum fails, and Zelensky can argue he tried to secure peace, but his people rejected insufficient guarantees. If it passes, even narrowly, he gains democratic legitimacy for painful concessions that would otherwise haunt his presidency. It also puts pressure on Russia to agree to a meaningful ceasefire, since Putin cannot credibly claim to be seeking peace while refusing to stop attacks long enough for Ukrainians to vote on a peace proposal. For Trump, having any agreement ratified through a democratic process in Ukraine strengthens the political sustainability of the deal domestically in America, where Republicans would face criticism for imposing terms on Ukraine that Ukrainians themselves hadn't endorsed. Russia's response to the diplomatic momentum has been characteristically duplicitous, combining continued engagement in negotiations with demonstrative uses of military force. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov told state media that Moscow had been in contact with American representatives and that dialogue would continue. Presidential spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said the Kremlin was still forming its position on the latest 20-point proposal. These anodyne statements suggest Russia is keeping channels open and hasn't rejected engagement outright. But the substance of Moscow's position reveals significant gaps between what Ukraine and America are proposing and what Putin is prepared to accept. Russia's fundamental demands remain largely unchanged from positions it has articulated since before the full-scale invasion began. Moscow insists that Ukraine abandon any aspiration to join NATO, a demand that the current peace framework essentially accepts by substituting bilateral security guarantees for alliance membership. More problematic is Russia's territorial maximalism. Putin has demanded that Ukraine withdraw entirely from the Donetsk and Luhansk regions that together comprise the Donbass, territory that Russia illegally annexed in September 2022. Moscow currently controls most of Luhansk and approximately 70% of Donetsk. But Putin is demanding the remaining portions as well, even though Russian forces have been unable to capture them militarily. This represents an ultimatum that Ukraine continues to reject. Zelensky's offer to withdraw from portions of Donetsk in exchange for reciprocal Russian withdrawal and creation of demilitarized zones represents a significant compromise from Ukraine's original position, but it falls far short of Russia's demands for complete Ukrainian capitulation in the east. The timing and nature of today's attack on Kyiv provides insight into how Moscow views these negotiations. Russia launched nearly 500 drones and 40 missiles of various types at Ukraine overnight, focusing on energy infrastructure and residential areas in the capital. The assault employed Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, Iskander ballistic missiles, and Kalibr cruise missiles in the initial wave, followed by waves of Iranian-designed Shahed drones that kept air raid sirens wailing for nearly 10 hours. When Zelensky asked publicly where Russia's response was to American and international proposals for ending the war, he provided his own answer with dark irony, stating that Kinzhals and Shaheds speak for Russian representatives in reality. The attack cut heating to 4,000 residential buildings in the capital, knocked out power across multiple districts, and forced elderly residents to evacuate a care facility as flames spread through the building. This was not incidental violence, but a calculated message timed to arrive less than 24 hours before Zelensky sits down with Trump. The message Moscow is sending is multi-layered. First, Russia is demonstrating that it retains the capability to inflict significant damage on Ukraine despite nearly 4 years of attrition warfare and Western military support. Second, it's reminding Zelensky that any peace agreement must be acceptable to Moscow, and that Russia can make the costs of refusing Putin's terms unbearable for Ukrainian civilians. Third, it's signaling to Trump that Russia negotiates from a position it perceives as strength, and that American pressure alone won't compel Moscow to accept terms Putin views as insufficient. Fourth, it's creating facts on the ground that complicate Zelensky's political position, since agreeing to territorial concessions while Russian bombs are still falling on Kyiv plays into domestic accusations that he's surrendering under pressure rather than securing genuine peace. Russian officials provided additional signals about Moscow's thinking through carefully orchestrated leaks. The Kommersant newspaper reported that Putin told Russian businessmen he might be open to swapping some occupied territory, but insisted on retaining all of the Donbass. This suggests some flexibility on Russia's part regarding territories outside the eastern regions it illegally annexed, but continued maximalism about the areas Putin has designated as non-negotiable. Trump's role in these negotiations introduces both opportunity and volatility into what's already an extremely complex diplomatic situation. The president has repeatedly expressed confidence that he can broker a deal to end the war, telling reporters this week that prospects for peace have a good shot, and that both Russia and Ukraine want to reach agreement now. His self-assurance about his deal-making abilities and his relationships with both Zelensky and Putin could prove either an asset or a liability, depending on whether his assessment of the situation matches reality. Trump has the authority and willingness to offer Ukraine substantial security guarantees and economic support that would make territorial concessions more palatable for Kyiv. He also has sufficient leverage over both parties to potentially force movement on issues where negotiations have stalled. The former president's comments this week revealed both his sense of ownership over the process and his tendency to undercut his negotiating partners in public. When asked about Zelensky's latest proposals, Trump told Politico bluntly that the Ukrainian president doesn't have anything until Trump approves it, and that they'll see what Zelensky has to offer. This kind of public dismissiveness, even if tactically intended to manage expectations, undercuts Zelensky's negotiating position by signaling that Ukraine cannot offer terms without American approval. It reinforces the perception that this is ultimately a deal being negotiated between Washington and Moscow, with Kyiv's role reduced to accepting or rejecting terms worked out by the major powers. For domestic Ukrainian politics, this is deeply problematic, since it feeds into Russian narratives that Ukraine lacks genuine sovereignty and that Zelensky is merely a proxy for Western interests. Trump's selection of envoys reflects his preference for personal loyalty and deal-focused businessmen over traditional diplomatic professionals. Steve Witkoff, his main point person on Ukraine, built his career in real estate and has no background in foreign policy or Eastern European affairs. Yet Witkoff's direct access to Trump and his focus on finding transactional solutions rather than getting bogged down in diplomatic precedent has reportedly helped move negotiations forward. Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, who previously worked on Middle East policy during Trump's first term, has also been involved in the Ukraine discussions. Both men reportedly had positive interactions with Zelensky and his chief negotiator, Rustem Umerov, on Christmas Day, with Zelensky characterizing the conversation as really good. The unusual nature of having the president's son-in-law and a real estate developer leading American diplomacy on one of the most consequential security issues facing Europe illustrates Trump's governing style, which prioritizes personal relationships and business-like pragmatism over institutional norms. The structure Trump has proposed for implementing and enforcing any peace deal reflects his desire to position himself at the center of the agreement. The Peace Council concept, with Trump as chair and authority to reimpose sanctions if Russia violates terms, ensures his continued personal involvement and gives him a mechanism to claim credit for maintaining peace. It also creates a vehicle for him to pressure either party if implementation runs into trouble. For Ukraine, this provides some reassurance that America won't simply walk away after an agreement is signed, since Trump's personal prestige would be tied to the deal's success. For Russia, it creates a direct channel to the American president that bypasses traditional diplomatic structures Moscow often finds frustrating. The downside is that any peace framework so personally identified with Trump could become vulnerable if political circumstances change in Washington or if Trump loses interest in maintaining enforcement mechanisms. European nations are watching tomorrow's meeting with a mixture of hope and deep anxiety about being sidelined in negotiations that will fundamentally affect European security. Zelensky emphasized that he wants Europeans involved in both tomorrow's meeting and any final agreement, but acknowledged that organizing European participation on short notice would be difficult. A conference call scheduled for Saturday with Trump, Zelensky, and several European leaders represents an attempt to keep allies in the loop. But the reality is that this has become primarily a bilateral negotiation between Washington and Moscow, with Ukraine trying to preserve its interests and Europe struggling to maintain relevance. This represents a significant shift from earlier phases of the war, when European nations, particularly Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, played central roles in both supporting Ukraine militarily and attempting diplomatic solutions. The marginalization of Europe in these talks reflects several factors. First, European nations have proven unable to develop a unified position on how to end the war, with countries ranging from Poland and the Baltic states advocating maximum support for Ukraine until Russia is defeated, to Hungary openly sympathetic to Moscow's position, and major powers like Germany and France caught between supporting Ukraine and managing their domestic political challenges. Second, European military and economic support for Ukraine, while substantial in aggregate, pales in comparison to American assistance. giving Washington overwhelming leverage in any negotiations. Third, Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy views European participation as complicating deal-making rather than adding legitimacy, and he's shown little patience for the kind of multilateral diplomacy that characterized previous American approaches to European security. For European security architecture more broadly, the implications of how this war ends could be profound. If Trump succeeds in brokering a deal that's perceived as forcing Ukraine into territorial concessions to appease Putin, it could fundamentally undermine the post-Cold War consensus that borders in Europe should not be changed by force. NATO's eastern members, particularly Poland and the Baltic states, would draw conclusions about the reliability of American security guarantees if Washington is seen as trading Ukrainian territory for peace. This could accelerate European efforts to develop autonomous defense capabilities independent of American leadership, a development that would reshape transatlantic relations. Conversely, if Trump can secure an agreement that includes robust security guarantees for Ukraine and meaningful costs for Russia if it violates terms, it could demonstrate that American leadership can still produce outcomes that protect European interests, even if the process doesn't follow traditional diplomatic norms. Several key indicators will signal whether tomorrow's summit produces substantive progress or merely continues the diplomatic theater. First, whether Trump and Zelensky emerge with a joint statement or framework document would indicate they've reached enough agreement to present something concrete publicly. The absence of any joint product would suggest significant gaps remain. Second, the tone and body language in any public appearances will be scrutinized for signs of tension or genuine partnership, particularly given the February falling out that required significant repair work to overcome. Third, whether Trump commits to specific timelines for concluding an agreement and moving toward implementation would indicate his level of engagement and urgency. Fourth, any announcement of Trump's willingness to visit Ukraine or of hosting Putin at Mar-a-Lago for direct talks would represent a significant escalation of presidential involvement. On the substance, watch for movement on three specific issues that remain most contentious. The duration of American security guarantees matters enormously to Ukraine, with the difference between a 15-year agreement and something longer representing the gap between a temporary solution and a genuine strategic partnership. The specific mechanisms for enforcing any demilitarized zones in eastern Ukraine will determine whether such zones actually constrain Russian military options or simply create frozen conflict lines that Moscow can violate with impunity. And the question of how quickly any agreement would move toward a referendum in Ukraine will reveal whether there's genuine momentum or whether both sides are still positioning rather than seriously negotiating. Zelensky's insistence on at least 60 days of ceasefire before any vote creates a clear test of Russian seriousness, since Moscow's refusal to stop attacks would expose Putin's stated desire for peace as rhetorical rather than genuine. The broader context of Trump's diplomatic efforts also matters for interpreting tomorrow's meeting. The president is hosting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Monday, just one day after the Zelensky summit, as part of his stated ambition to end both the Ukraine war and the ongoing Middle East conflicts. This back-to-back scheduling reflects Trump's view that he can personally resolve multiple complex geopolitical crises simultaneously through force of will and deal-making prowess. It also creates potential for spillover effects, where progress or failure on one negotiation influences his approach to others. If tomorrow's meeting produces positive momentum, Trump may feel emboldened to push harder for concessions from both Israel and Palestinian representatives in Monday's discussions. If it flounders, he may become more skeptical about the prospects for diplomatic solutions generally. The strategic question facing Zelensky tomorrow is whether to accept a deal now that involves significant territorial concessions, but ends the killing and provides security guarantees and economic reconstruction, or to continue fighting in hopes of improving Ukraine's position before eventually negotiating. This dilemma has no obviously correct answer, and different Ukrainian constituencies hold passionate views on both sides. Those favoring accepting terms now argue that the war has reached a military stalemate where neither side can achieve decisive victory without catastrophic escalation, that Ukraine's ability to continue fighting depends on Western support that's increasingly uncertain as political winds shift in Washington and European capitals, and that every month of continued warfare means thousands more Ukrainian casualties and billions more in destroyed infrastructure. Waiting for better terms risks facing worse ones later if Western support erodes or Russian forces achieve breakthrough offensive success. Those opposing a deal on current terms argue that accepting territorial losses now would reward Russian aggression and create precedent for future invasions, that Ukraine's position is actually stronger than often acknowledged given its success in degrading Russian military capabilities and maintaining territorial integrity in most of the country, and that the security guarantees being offered are insufficient to prevent Russia from simply rearming and attacking again in 5 or 10 years. They point out that previous agreements with Russia, including the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons in exchange for security assurances, proved worthless when Moscow decided to invade. Why should anyone believe that Russian commitments this time would be any more reliable? The referendum mechanism Zelensky has proposed is his attempt to resolve this fundamental disagreement by democratizing the decision, but it also means the Ukrainian people will collectively bear responsibility for whatever choice emerges. The pressure on Zelensky is immense and multidimensional. Internationally, he faces Trump's clearly communicated expectation that Ukraine needs to be realistic about what's achievable and accept a deal that Trump views as reasonable. European allies, while publicly supportive, are privately signaling exhaustion with the costs of supporting Ukraine indefinitely. Domestically, Ukrainian society is strained after nearly 4 years of total war, with hundreds of thousands killed or wounded, millions displaced, and entire cities reduced to rubble. Many Ukrainians desperately want the war to end, but nationalist constituencies and veterans groups are already signaling opposition to any territorial concessions, arguing that accepting Russian occupation of any Ukrainian land betrays those who died defending it. Zelensky must navigate between these competing pressures while knowing that whatever decision he makes will define both his legacy and Ukraine's future for generations. As Zelensky prepared for his flight to Florida this evening, emergency workers in Kyiv were still pulling bodies from rubble and attempting to restore heating to thousands of buildings left without power by this morning's Russian bombardment. The juxtaposition captures the fundamental dynamic of tomorrow's negotiation. Ukraine is being asked to negotiate peace while still under sustained attack, to accept territorial losses while Russian forces continue to bomb its capital, to trust American security guarantees while Russia demonstrates that Western support hasn't prevented the destruction of Ukrainian cities. Yet the alternative to negotiation is continued warfare with no clear path to decisively changing the strategic balance, mounting casualties, and no guarantee that waiting will produce better terms. The meeting tomorrow at Mar-a-Lago will not by itself end this war, but it could establish the framework within which ending becomes possible, if the parties can bridge gaps that in some cases reflect genuinely incompatible positions about security, sovereignty, and justice. The outcome depends on whether Trump can convince Zelensky that the security guarantees America and Europe will provide are sufficiently robust to deter future Russian aggression, whether Moscow can be pressured into accepting that it cannot simply dictate terms to Ukraine and must genuinely withdraw forces to allow peace to take hold, and whether the Ukrainian people believe that accepting painful territorial compromises today prevents worse outcomes tomorrow. These are not primarily technical questions about the language in diplomatic documents. They're fundamental questions about power, trust, and the willingness to accept imperfect solutions to seemingly intractable problems. As missiles fell on Kyiv this morning, residents took shelter in metro stations and basements, many of them no longer registering shock or surprise at the violence that has become their daily reality. For these Ukrainians, the question is not whether any peace is better than no peace, but whether the specific peace being negotiated tomorrow provides genuine security or simply postpones the next round of violence. Trump will enter tomorrow's meeting confident he can broker a deal that ends the war and cements his legacy as a peacemaker. Putin will be calculating whether accepting some territorial concessions in exchange for Ukraine's permanent exclusion from NATO and implicit acknowledgement of Russian sphere of influence achieves his strategic objectives. Zelensky will be fighting to preserve Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security, while recognizing that his negotiating position depends entirely on American support that Trump could withdraw at any moment. The math is brutal. Ukraine cannot win this war without American help, but America doesn't need Ukraine to achieve Trump's goals. That asymmetry defines the real power dynamic tomorrow, regardless of the diplomatic niceties. The question is whether Zelensky can leverage the only card he has, the political and reputational cost to Trump, if he's seen as forcing Ukraine into a bad deal, to secure terms that Ukraine can actually live with. By Sunday evening, the world will have a clearer sense of whether 3 years of war are approaching an end, or whether the diplomatic process, like so many before it, will prove insufficient to bridge gaps that can ultimately only be resolved on the battlefield. What's certain is that tomorrow's meeting matters, not because it will definitively end the war, but because it will reveal whether ending the war through negotiation remains possible at all. If I ask you to give me a niche for YouTube channel that is unsaturated and has high RPM, then which niche will you recommend? Remember that I will use an AI avatar in videos,